Hello, Cadre 2. This is a video um, that gives us an introduction into some of the critical issues and understandings in policy and political leadership. As you can tell, I'm here in my man cave at the house. Well, in fact, all of you have been here before, so it shouldn't be totally unfamiliar. Clearly, this is not a professional video job. Number one, that's going to be first take, last take, and as you can tell, I haven't spent any time in a makeup room. This is the way I really look, particularly on a Sunday afternoon. I'm kind of halfway watching the girls play Purdue, and they're right now getting their socks beat off, but they seem to be gaining some ground. So anyway, concentrate on this video, and there will be a series of these, maybe 4 or 5. That'll be about 10 minutes each in length. And there'll be a single topic about policy and political leadership. And they should be the kind that you can watch in 8 to 10 minute segments and get an idea as to what we want to have you understand. It's critical that you watch these before class so that we can simply pick up from there in our opening activities when we meet again on March 16th. And we're looking forward to that. Okay, this is Policy 101. What is policy? I think that's the key word here. Policy actually comes from a Greek word, the Greek word of polis. And this is not like the My Big Fat American Greek Wedding, where the father-in-law basically said everything was a Greek word, but this one happens to be a Greek word, and some of you may not even know what the heck I'm talking about with the My Big Fat Greek Wedding. But the word polis comes from the word public. And in the Greek society, ancient Greek society, polis was the marketplace. It's where people came basically every day to buy foodstuffs, exchange goods. Groups of people, particularly the men, would meet in groups to simply talk about current events, the events of the day, issues that were of importance to the community or the state in some cases. And it was a marketplace of goods and services, ideas, conversation, and so forth. So the carryover to that, to the word policy, has to do with the word public. Policy is a public function, and so usually requires some kind of a vote or sanction or approval to make it official. But anyway, it's a public kind of activity. And I think that's key to the first understanding what the word policy means. It also means direction or purpose. Policies don't get created because there's not a reason for them. There always is a reason for a policy to be created. And so policy attempts to outline an intent, a purpose, or a direction that whoever this public group is intending to go. And so policy can take a variety of forms. In our society today, policies can be laws. They can be resolutions. For example, our legislature passes resolutions all the time, which tend to be reserving a spot or a priority for an interim study that is conducted during the summer to be ready for the next legislative year upon which they intend to do more in-depth policy development. Most recently, the Nebraska legislature conducted an interim study on school finance. Going all over the state, having public hearings so people could have input, kind of like the marketplace idea. And then they also had one, in addition to many others, on early childhood issues. The Nebraska Children and Families Foundation, of which I'm also a part of, had a big role in that, in both looking at preschool education and looking at before and after school programs and those kinds of things that are necessary to support our students and families in our school. Policies can take the form of statutes, as you well know, rules and regulations. For example, Rule 10, the accreditation rule in the State Department of Education, is a policy statement. It talks about having highly qualified teachers and what it takes then to be a highly qualified teacher or a certified teacher. Rules and regulations about certification of teachers, about accreditation of schools, about multicultural education, about school finance and budget development. All the rules and regulations, some 90 of them at the State Department of Education, would also be policies. What sometimes we don't think of as policies are things like handbooks, teacher handbooks, administrative handbooks, student handbooks. They have statements about purpose. They have statements about procedures, and as a result, they come under the heading of what a policy would be. Many times, policies can be what are called strategic documents, such as a strategic plan, or such as outlining a set of steps or priorities of things to be accomplished, coming under the heading of planning kind of documents. While you don't think a plan for 10-year replacement of buses or roofs or something like that as policy, it does usually state some kind of a direction or intent, which is to maximize the expenditure of the district in its infrastructure, such as its buses or its roofs or its rehabbing of buildings and so forth. Reports can also be policy, typically reports on what's going on. The executive summaries usually indicate not only what was found in the report or in the activity, but also what some next steps might happen to be. So basically, policies outline the way business is to be done, the purpose of it, the intention of it, and sometimes it's traditional and customary, sometimes it's normative practices, and sometimes it's just simply the way we've always done it, which are policy kinds of statements in and of themselves. So these things become formal policy when a board who's legally sanctioned to do so approves them or adopts them, but they can also be policy documents that are formal by virtue of outlining the way things have always been done. Well, there's two kinds of policy. One is policy by design. That is highly intentional, very purposeful, like the TIOSA school aid formula. They're usually formally vetted in a process of creating legislation, and they're usually publicly posted, printed, distributed, that kind of thing. Again, TIOSA is a classic example. The new statutes on attendance and the relationship of attendance to being truant is another example. Again, they are voted on, formally vetted, and then posted or printed and distributed. The other kind of policy is tricky and tends to be ignored, but tends to rear its head when decisions are made and there isn't any direct route or direct linkage to a printed or written kind of policy, the policy by design. And these are called policies by default. And these are typically the way we've always done things, routine practices, traditions, customs, and so forth. Let me give you an example before I go in to more detail on that. In a school district in Kansas, and where I was a superintendent, had a practice of school bus drivers checking in somewhere between 5:45 and 6 o'clock, punching the time clock, going to check their bus, give a once-over of the bus, but then come back in and drink coffee for a half hour to 45 minutes before they then headed out on their bus route. It was a way of making sure we checked in with all the drivers, making sure we had an opportunity to deal with any kind of issues that were coming up at that particular point in time. They kind of replaced some of the meetings we would normally have with drivers, but a lot of it was simply a social time for the drivers to get acquainted and meet with the bus supervisor. And I would show up from time to time just to show them that I appreciated their work. Well, when it came down to the dismissal of a fairly popular bus driver who had started basically showing up just at the time when the buses were supposed to exit the barns and head out on their routes. He had been given a directive to check in at least earlier so that he could go and at least do a walkthrough on his bus before he got in. You know, those do a basic kick the tires kind of safety check, which he hadn't been doing, and he basically refused to do that, so he was fired. He filed claim to back overtime because he had been required and had done so fairly faithfully for almost 15, probably more years, closer to 20, and claimed overtime for that 5:45 to 6:45 time frame before the buses headed out, and claimed it as overtime. Well, it ended up costing us in excess of $40,000 to pay for that time for all the drivers, not just this one, but all of them, because it was a usual and customary kind of practice. In other words, it was the way we did things. And as a result, it was policy by default. And so the same thing can happen when you require teachers to check in a certain time in the morning, when you allow them to check out at a certain time of the day, even though that may not be stated anywhere, it may not even be in the contract as such, but if that's the way you do things, then that's the way the policy is interpreted because it's a customary kind of practice. Another example that got into a huge contract negotiation issue, North Platte, in fact, was in one of the elementary schools, a standing practice was it was the teacher's responsibility to clean their own blackboards and chalkboards, which when I found out after we got out of the trouble that we were in with it, we banned that practice and said that's not their job. That's why we hire a custodial staff. But a teacher had gotten themselves in difficulty because they wouldn't do that and kept complaining about it. And so the principal decided to put them on intensive care kind of discipline and then recommended that they be dismissed the following year. And while we did actually win the case on the dismissal because there was more to it than just the blackboard kind of issue, because she had clearly been ordered to do that and refused to do it, and so it became down to insubordination. We lost it on the principle of the case of whether or not that should be something a teacher should do, and when nobody else in the district had to do it. But in that particular school, it was a usual and customary practice. So it wasn't that it by itself stood up in the hearing process. It was the fact that there were other issues involved, and so there was a customary practice that was policy in effect in that particular school by default. And default policy, if it's the regular and customary practice, has the same weight to it that those that are written or clearly kind of stated. Another example of one, if this was helpful, we had a practice that said that teachers were to be on duty from 8 to 4, but that under special circumstances they could leave at 3:30 if they had certain kind of things to go to, such as a child's activity or something involving their spouse or something of that type. And so we had a teacher that basically was leaving every day at 3:30. Not even bothering to let the office know that they were going to be gone, but then after they had been admonished and directed to both stay till 4 o'clock or come and at least let the principal know what was going on, refused to do so, but claimed that 4-H activities, Girl Scouts, soccer practice, softball practice, whatever, was the issue. And so while we had a practice of allowing this, the issue became whether and how hard we were going to stick on the notion that she had to notify the principal. Well, that did stand up, but the practice, we were scorned quite clearly by the hearing officer of saying, if you allow this, and we had allowed this to go on for probably 6 months before we'd even called attention to it, we basically backed off in terms of the decision of the hearing to dismiss the teacher and said, all right, let's clean the slate. Let's start all over again. Here's the way it's going to be. It worked out all right, but it was one of those things where policy by default got in the way of doing what we wanted to do. Well, again, I think the point is policy has a purpose, policy has an intent, policy sets a direction, policy can set up procedures that need to be followed, but basically it's a public process, normally requires some kind of formal approval, like a vote or adoption by a legal board, but the approval of a process by having it be standard practice of the district, standard practice of the superintendent, can make it be policy by default. Well, that includes this one. We'll move on to the next one as soon as I can get this one stopped and downloaded, and then we'll go on from there with the next topic.